Testing, is it on my face? All right, cool.
All right, JD, you can begin whenever you're ready.
Okay. Let's talk about drugs. By show of hands, who here has done drugs? I'm just kidding. You guys don't have to do that. I just want to preface this whole thing by saying drugs are bad. Don't do them. All right? No way am I an advocate. However, I am an advocate of funny and interesting stories. And it just so happens one of the greatest rock bands of all time had taken drugs, and we ended up with some pretty funny stories. So, if you don't mind, let me take you guys on a trip through strawberry fields, skies littered with diamonds, and admittedly one stoner named Lucille, through seas of yellow submarines, and a land where we can all come together. So, the first time the Beatles ever really interacted with any recreational drugs was around 1964. And keep in mind, during this time, they were huge. I Want to Hold Your Hand had just come out, and that song is global. So naturally, when another global superstar comes up to you and says, "Hey, want to smoke some reefer?" the Beatles naturally stick to their values and say, "Why, yes we would." Now you may be wondering, who is this superstar that got the Beatles to try recreational drugs? Only one of their biggest idols, Bob Dylan. So for the first time they all did it, they were in a hotel room, probably about half the size of this room. So everyone on this side, the hotel room was probably this size. It was the Beatles in a circle with Bob Dylan and all their friends, passing around a joint. I don't think it gets any more 60s than that. It got to the point that when they started using it quite frequently, that John Lennon was quoted saying, "He's like, oh yeah, during the early '60s, we basically had weed for breakfast. They would smoke it every day, all the time." It got to the point that Richard Lester, the director of their second film, Help, would actually have to shoot around their weed schedule. He'd have to record really early in the morning because they'd start smoking around 12 o'clock. One of the last points I want to mention on the whole weed thing is that they were actually advocates for weed legalization, funny enough, in 1967. Now we start getting into some of the harder stuff. So everyone knows that the Beatles had dropped acid, clearly. So you may be wondering, how did they get introduced to LSD, you know? Turns out, the first Beatles to take LSD were John and George. John was the one with the glasses. George was the one that never really said anything. So what ended up happening was John and George and their significant others went to a friend's house to meet up, have some, just chill. And it turned out that their friend had some other plans and had spiked their coffee with LSD. And they had no idea. So they were just sitting around sipping coffee, and then getting shifty looks from their friend, and they're like, "What's going on?" And then John Lennon goes to George and says, "He drugged us." And they're like, "What is that? With what?" And they're like, he said LSD. And no one really knew what LSD was at this time. This was in 1965. So, kind of freaked out, they leave. And this is, after they leave, this is when it starts really hitting them. If you know anything about acid, you know it is incredibly psychedelic. So they end up going to a bar, and that's when it reaches its high point. George Harrison said, "It was one of the greatest feelings of my life, but holy hell was it scary when things got erratic." It got to the point where at one point in the bar, George actually thought a bomb went off, and he was freaking out, but it just turned out that the bar closed and they turned the lights on. Alright, the next big drug that they had done was cocaine. Now, you're probably wondering which one of them did it. You guys probably think John. John was the cool one. It was actually Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney actually had taken cocaine for about a year and a half. At the point, he even had a coke buddy. One of the funniest stories I read up on was that after snorting some coke on a toilet seat in one of in some club, he ran into Jimi Hendrix. Again, I have to say again, it doesn't get any more 60s than that. And the worst drug that any Beatle had taken was heroin. And that was mainly taken by John Lennon over here. But John Lennon wasn't the first one introduced to heroin, though. Richard Lester, again, director of the second film, had saw Paul McCartney talking to these two absolutely beautiful women, Richard Lester said. And they're like, dressing very scantily clad. And they were trying to say, oh, you should try this with us. And Richard Lester said it was one of the most evil things he'd ever seen. And funny enough, Paul said no. He said, nope, coke for me. But overall, John Lennon was the one that actually really did heroin. However, he was able to quit it only on one basis. He never really injected it. He just sniffed it. Because John Lennon, the rock god, was afraid of needles. So, in conclusion, drugs are still bad. Don't do drugs. But you can get some pretty funny stories out of it.